In this segment on shamanism, I want to talk a little bit more about sex and the neutral aspect of sex, because sex is a channel, a conduit, a vehicle that serves as an amplification of pre-existing patterns. And so, for example, in the full spectrum of the psyche, in the full spectrum of emotions, there are those parts of us that love, that adore. There are those parts that need, that honor. There are those parts that are beautifully innocent and alive. And there are those parts that hurt, that feel envious, that want to take. And sexuality is often a conduit for all of who we are. And so it's an opportunity for alchemy. So I'll just share a couple of the different directional energy flows that I find to be important in sex. So one is the blessing of masked and shamed, culturally taboo parts of the self. For example, in America, it is shameful to have needs. But the fact that a given culture at a given point in time decides, as part of its cultural identity, to deny, show embarrassment, and hide the aspect of every human being that is deeply, profoundly, and beautifully needy. Or in the case of the cultural blindness, helplessly and pathetically and disgustingly needy through the lens of, for example, American culture. Neither lens takes away from the fact that every human being has mental, physical, and emotional needs. Now, we are not so crazy that we judge and shame the need to breathe, the need to eat, the need to drink, the need to move, the need to exercise, etc. In our materialism, we're able to segment that off and say that's the physical body, but that's completely separate from the emotional and mental body. Sure, another human being can kill you with a gun, but if you are a real man, another human being cannot break your heart. And so it's kind of a little bit of an insanity with the reality of how the bodies line up together, mentally, emotionally, physically, that, without the physical body, there is no ego self, mental, emotional, and so, you're completely vulnerable through the physical body. But something that good psychologists know is that without hope, that without love, without a desire to live with self-loathing, one will find a way to rapidly erode the physical basis for existence, that our thoughts, that our beliefs, our emotions are as potent and powerful as our physical body in determining who we are as human beings. And so it's really chauvinism, the exaltation of physical matter to the exclusion, to the shaming, to the diminishment of emotions, and to a lesser degree thoughts, i.e. it's just in your head. It's just in your body. That's a big deal. You've got a bullet in your body. Oh, we've got to, change the world to get that bullet out of your body. But it's just in your head. Who gives a shit that you're carrying a virus of shame? Now, this ties into why I think it's important to be conscious and to use the time of sexual amplification to open to bringing what is healthy in us into our body in a deeper way. And this is where mental emotional programming is very important. So one of the things that's important as a direction is to combat shame by honoring and valuing and respecting. Respect is Latin spect, to see, to see and to see again. When you respect something, when you respect someone, you are present and present again to who they are. When you show someone, something, respect, when you show money, respect, when you look honestly at what creates and what diminishes money, we learn, we show respect for that particular energy. When we look closely at our partner and what honors him or her, what grows him or her, and what diminishes him or her, we not only show respect, we show love and wisdom when we use that information to grow one another. So, one direction is a direction of validation, of respect, of honor, and of loving what is. What do I mean by that? We are saddled with cultural wounds that split us up into cubes of acceptability and unacceptability, and typically spend a certain amount of energy locking up, criticizing, judging, and shaming those parts of ourselves that are unacceptable. That corresponds with what we do within the culture on a national level. So if we look at the United States, where 2% of the population is in the justice system, either in prison, on parole, about to be in prison. We have 2% in prison, but we have roughly 30% of the population potentially in prison, meaning that if given the thousands of laws in place that can be seen as the cultural taboo and judgments, if we had adequate evidence and enough law enforcement, we could literally take the United States and employ a third of the population to gather evidence and put people in prison and serve as wardens in prisons and build prisons. And then we would use that third to imprison the other third, who, if everyone was caught for all the speeding tickets, all the lies, all the stealing, all the tax evasion, all the embezzlement, all the spousal abuse, all the childhood abuse, all the pet abuse, all the traumas of the United States, which are, our response is to judge and criminalize, which is what we do with ourselves, to judge and punish, as opposed to understand, love, and heal a very deep hereditary cultural wound that we each come in completely innocent of. And we have that wound laid on us in such density that usually by the time we have language, and certainly the time we have reason and sense of conscious identity, we identify not only as the recipient of that wound, but as the perpetrator of that wound. So, in my case, the amount of physical, emotional abuse that I received before even language was such that some of my first memories were waking up and finding myself puzzled why I was being cruel to other children. And it's only later that I'm able to say, of course, children are mirrors. And so I was doing to those children exactly what my mother and father and other children were doing to me, because I had already received the wound. But this in itself is taboo to talk about. It's taboo to acknowledge the wound that we all carry. It's taboo to acknowledge how devastatingly painful that wound is. It's taboo to acknowledge the fact that some of those pains are so deep that it is only in the safe love and cocoon with a kind and tender partner, a kind and tender therapist, a kind and tender support group, do we have the courage, the energy, the strength and resources to face that pain and cry those tears and scream those rages and not get lost in the wound, but called back to who we are. And this gets to the heart of shamanism, because we are all wounded. Just being physical in this modern age is a profound wound to the consciousness that connects us with our spiritual family. A spiritual family that most of us have been so cut off from that in our heart of hearts, even if we're involved in metaphysics and spirituality for decades, we may have no visceral memories, no visceral sense of. We may talk, we may read books about spiritual guides, we may talk about loving ourselves and God, Goddess, but the wound is so deep and the feeling is so numb that for many of us, we've never had a conscious, completely visceral knowing of what divine energy is, and knowing with certainty that we are loved, that we are accepted, that we are valued, that we are honored, that we are completely and totally healed and loved in the eyes of the divine. I know for myself that I had very vague sense of that despite thousands of hours of meditation. And it was not until I, in somewhat as of a last resort, because I had a bit of a snooty attitude. I'd never been drunk, I'd never taken drugs and all that, and I didn't want any shortcuts. But having tried more than $250,000 in therapy and energy work, and having my house filled with literally 2 tons of crystals, and still feeling disconnected from myself and others and divinity in ways that were hard to articulate but incredibly painful, I found myself contemplating ending my own life, recognizing that my pain was so intense that I did not want to live. And this is where the gift of a good, grounded, rational mind can come in. I said, okay, fine. That's okay. If you are clear that you've tried everything you can possibly try, and you're in more pain than pleasure or well-being, and you've already got the money, and you've already got the freedom, and you've already got the woman, and you've already got the things, the toys, and you've already got the freedom, and you've already done, $200,000 in therapy, and you've already bought all the crystals, and you've done the workshops, and the pain is so intense that you would like to leave rather than stay on this planet, fine. But let's just do a review and see if there's anything we haven't left off, because it'd be kind of a shame and a bit of a joke, having, gone through 40 years of the absurdities of being human, to get to the other side, look back and say, gee, you never went here. So my first wave was, of course, to travel around the world, because I thought, maybe there's a culture that's much healthier than United States culture, and particularly United States male culture, because if you look at many cultural continuums, you will find that United States males stand out in the top 2% of disconnected, unemotional, lonely, and shamed human beings in human history. The amount of materialism, the amount of focus on work, the amount of shame and emotion, the amount of cultural confusion, the disconnection between men and themselves, the disconnection of men and other men, it's pretty severe. And so first I traveled around the world and found Thailand. Second, I thought, well, when the next wave hit, let's look at all the things you haven't done that you might want to do before you die. And so I made a bucket list and, crossed off all my mental bucket list. So my mental bucket list were all the things that were annoying me, one, and all the things that I thought, it's worth a try. So I did hang gliding and paragliding and jumping out of a plane, and went to Vegas and saw all my favorite Cirque du Soleil shows, and learned kite surfing, and went to Maui and bought toys and bought a sailboat and did all this stuff. And that was certainly fun for a couple of years. And then the wave hit again. And you've been around the world, and you've done everything on your bucket list, and you've got all the things, and it's a crushing wave. And it's like, I don't know what's hitting me. And that's when I decided to do psychedelics. In sheer desperation, with a very snooty attitude like, that's cheating, I don't want anything that's not sustainable, etc. I don't want to just feel good. I want real spiritual growth. But I read a couple of books that suggested, some by Terence McKenna, another book called Acid Test, which dealt a lot with PTSD. And I realized that there was some validity to taking a very conscious, therapeutic, spiritual approach to using low doses in a sacred setting and learning about this frontier. And I did. I learned to viscerally connect with a sense of self that I hadn't known since coming into American culture and being cut off from that. And of course, when one awakens, it's a little bit like Novocaine wearing off in your mouth. And what generally happens if you're like me, is that when you've got severe painkillers in a part of your body and you keep moving and you can't feel it, you end up biting and bleeding and hurting that part of the body because you don't know it's there. You can't feel it. And so as this part of me came back into consciousness, now there's a wound because now I'm conscious of all the times that I've chewed on that very real sense of who I am. I've damaged that because I've been so numb to it. So now there's a whole grief and wave around that. But on the other side of that which is not a light journey. It is the shaman's path to disentangle, to unzip the many straps and handcuffs of the culture, to feel the intense pain and grief of being separate from self for so long, the intense pain and grief of the unconscious wounds that I've self-inflicted, to honor the culture, the pain and grief of seeing people I care about around me continuing to inflict those wounds on me and on themselves and on each other. The pain of being alone in that knowing. The grief of being so alone in the connection to self. And on the other side of all of that, which again is a whole 1,000 pages of nuanced journey in itself, is the awareness of a visceral sense through the true sense of self, of the divine, of consciousness that is so far beyond human, it is so far beyond human that it transcends the culture, that it transcends limited beliefs, and that heals, that responds to the depth of the wound that is so deep that no human can respond to it. And it is in this terrain, with that sense of connection, that sexuality can become a tool for that healing, a tool for bringing it in a couple of ways. One, sexuality at its best can transcend the ego and create an altered state in which self and spirit are remembered, are re-put together within the conscious mind of the person having the experience. And two, sexuality can be a playground in which to become conscious of the shadow, to become conscious of the part that wants revenge, that wants power, that wants dominance, that wants to hurt, that wants significance, that wants to be seen, that wants to express itself and be known, that wants to reconnect with the whole, as a tapestry of colors showing up in the sphere. And so the question becomes how to be an alchemist in this domain when we have the blues and the yellows, the blacks and the whites, the greens and the purples, the oranges, the reds. When we have the colors, the whole rainbow of the self showing up, what is the direction, what is the process or the recipe to create well-being with these ingredients? And it's a little bit of an intuitive dance. It's very spontaneous, and so I don't want to lay down rules. There are, it's a little bit like building a house. You can use a hammer, you can use a big hammer, you can bang a nail in with a rake, but a hammer is a little bit more efficient. You can cut things with a penknife, but a good saw is better, and an electric thing will make noise but do it very quickly. And so there's lots of different ways. And I think one of the most important things is to study the ways while being humble to the fact that the complexity of the program, the complexity of the energy field, particularly when you look at things like you can start to see it with for example, the current scientific paradigms of the space-time continuum use a torus shape, where there's this big, basically donut shape. And so you can see that there's things like folded time and stuff where if you go through this way, it's a little bit like taking a shortcut, where it's kind of like if you've got a long and winding road that goes all the way along here and for 26 miles and comes along here and comes back here. Or there's this little hidden shortcut path where you could just ride a motorcycle on this hiking trail, and in 300 or 400 yards you've bypassed that whole loop. And those are the kinds of things we need help with. We need to ask our guides, our spirit helpers, to support us with. And this gets back into the cultural wound, in which it's not okay to have needs, particularly as a man, and it's not okay to ask for help because that admits you need something. And so, and then there's this huge, rather humorous ideal of being completely independent. I don't need anything from anyone, I'm completely independent, as a way of escaping the cultural shame, which is the wound that we're given. And the reality is that everyone benefits when we are big enough to acknowledge our smallness, when we are big enough to ask for help, when we're big enough to recognize that for all of our 10-hour-a-day study courses for years, that what we know is a drop in the bucket compared to what we don't know. And that's not a reason not to bother knowing. It's more of a wisdom that comes from knowing enough to know how much we don't know. We don't study at all, we don't realize that there are literally hundreds of lifetimes of study in just a third of our many interests. And so there's just so many things we don't know. So we need help. And that's probably the most important thing, I think, in sexuality. Because I've learned, different rules and different principles. But the bottom line is resonance. Resonance for me and my partner with my lovely partner, Jen. There's many times where just adoring and holding her, sometimes like a newborn child, sometimes like a buddy, sometimes like a playmate, and sometimes like a spiritual teacher, she being my spiritual teacher. To just hold and focus on the heart. Focus on the heart and feel. It's like there's sometimes so much joy and abundance and love just pouring out of her heart. I just feel it creating all these different neuronal pathways and whole universes of possibility and joy and creativity. And I feel so honored just to hold space for that and to be around it and to have the great honor of loving that part. And to know that because 2/3 of the psyche is mental and emotional, and 1/3 is physical. We have these 3 equally valuable bodies, 2/3 of which are not physical, which means that the greatest richness is in the heart and in the mind, in healing the heart and the mind. And the value and the opportunity of the body and its density, it's kind of like 3 octaves of the same mind. The mental mind, the emotional mind, the physical mind. 3 octaves of the same self. That the value is in taking something beautiful on a mental, emotional level and making it more dense. So now that we've talked a little bit in general terms, let's explore some of the things that I've found useful. Again, not the path, not a path that has a label, but my path, the path that has brought well-being for me and for some others. So, number 1 in the sexual relational terrain. Respecting that sexuality is an amplification, that its function is to amplify and to create an altered state for the consciousness, to go places it could not go without that altered state. So that altered state can be created by psychedelics. It can be created by sex. Now, sex is a lot safer than psychedelics because the chemicals that are produced in our own body, our own DMT, our own connection with our pituitary gland, our hypothalamus, the different brain chemicals that we release, oxytocin. we are in touch with ourselves. It's not a foreign substance. It's rather creating the right conditions in which the self knows this is the time to have an amazing experience, to open up. And so it's got its built-in safety nets, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about it. And there don't tend to be bad trips if you're respecting yourself and respecting your partners, in the way that you can have, if you're not really ready to go into a certain terrain and you use a substance to propel yourself there. So let me just kind of go through some of the long division, which it's a little bit like riding a bicycle. It's, if you talk about push this pedal and balance here and lean there and steer there, it sounds very tedious. And when you're learning to ride a bicycle, you're going to get a few falls and scratches and lessons, and it's going to be maybe even uncomfortable and scary. But when you're riding the bicycle, and you know it, they become so fluid with practice that it's a real joy. It becomes spontaneous. And so I often find that successful flow is a well-informed intuition. In other words, try and intuitively ride a bike for the first time with no training or watching anyone else ride it. And whatever you're intuitively guided to do, you're probably statistically going to have a lot of accidents. Train yourself very well to ride a bicycle, and then intuitively get on and say, I want to go somewhere. And your educated intuition is 100 times more successful than one's ignorant intuition. And this is a really important principle regardless. In other words, that intuition is usually a shortcut for things we've learned to have confidence in and do very well. Relying on intuition to, for example, make a lot of money in the stock market without any training doesn't work statistically speaking. It's not a shortcut for training. It's a shortcut on the other side of excellent training. So George Soros, one of the world's foremost investors, does use his intuition, but it's an intuition that is founded on 10-hour days for decades studying the financial markets. And in that sense and in that context, having exposed himself to cycles, which is all, investments and there's a pattern of world cycles. And sometimes the unconscious and intuitive mind, if you've studied those for decades, is a little bit more in tuned, and your mental mind would have a hard time seeing the pattern. But the combination of the two, of the intuition that says, take a look at this, and then the mind that's got the training to say, oh yeah, this happened in the 40s, and the same kind of conditions are present now. We've got an intuition here. We've got a logical basis for understanding it. And so we're going to take a calculated risk based on an interpretation that the upside of this risk is bigger than the downside, to such an extent that, as most investors will tell you, is they bet on 5 to 20 things in a ratio where if any one of those take off, it will pay for the losses if every other guess is wrong. So they're not assuming that they're right in those 20 investments. They're assuming that one of them will be right. And so they've got a 5% odds in each investment. They're going to invest 100,000, and one of them is going to make them 200 million. One of them. And that's enough to pay for the losses of the other 19. In other words, they're expecting to lose and be wrong with their intuition and with decades of study and with careful analysis. They are expecting to be wrong 95% of the time. And they are expecting that the one time they're right will pay for being wrong 95% of the time. And so this is more of kind of an angel fund investment mindset. Coming back to that, you want to learn technique in any area that's important to you. You want to train yourself. You want to learn from people who you respect and believe have something to teach you. And you want to practice. You want to use discipline and care to learn what's important to you. So let me go into a couple of the things that are important to me. Number one is my heart opening, and is my partner's heart opening as we move closer, or is it clenching? So, for example, in my experience with the opposite sex, I've found that some women are very comfortable and happy to be sexual, but they've got a mechanism that makes it meaningless. And the mechanism is that they separate from their bodies, so it's meaningless, meaning they are not there, so it's just an empty body. Or they shut down emotionally, but are there mentally. Or they attack mentally, emotionally, so that they don't feel closer, even as their body is closer. So one way or another, if someone is not ready to move closer, they will put up physical, mental, or emotional impedance or withdraw altogether. That is a sign not to move closer. It's a sign to investigate. So if I'm moving closer to someone and, just to give you an example, I had one partner that was absolutely wonderful and present to talk with. And there'd be a moment when I felt really close to her because we were having such a great conversation. And so I would move towards touch. And she would disengage. She'd usually go to the bathroom. She'd say, "Excuse me," go to the bathroom. And by the time she came back, she was not present at all. And so I'm like, wait a minute, where'd you go? And that, we in a week we could not break through that barrier. In other words, she was really, really committed to not being there. And so I was clear, I'm not interested in being sexual with someone who doesn't want to be there with me. So we just, I was clear, we would not be lovers. And so this is the first metric. Does your heart and mind open mutually as you move closer? 2, do you have the honesty level? Have you built the culture, and are you clear that this is not a relationship of white lies, so that you can talk about any uncomfortability? And I pay attention. I pay attention to the thoughts that come up. For example, if I have a thought coming up in my mind of the ending of the relationship and it feeling painful to me, I'll pause and I'll say, wait a minute, have we had a good ending conversation? Have we agreed on, if have we agreed that this is going to be a beginning of a relationship, or is this one of those ambiguous things where we're going to have sex and then we're going to see what happens? And so, I may be like, yeah, I'm not okay with that. So let me pause and let's have a conversation. Is it a thrill killer? Absolutely. You may completely turn your partner off, yourself off, and yet I'm really clear, I don't want to build I don't want to create an ecstatic state or an altered state on a foundation that isn't solid enough to hold it. I want to build a container of clear expectations. So I will navigate that terrain when I'm being kind to myself. So I have a spectrum between doing this impeccably and carefully and well, and then I have a spectrum of being able to attract a partner who can do it impeccably and carefully and well, and then my partner will have a spectrum of being really patient with it rather than just trying to get off or something. And this is important terrain. This is foundation. And your body doesn't lie. Your body, your heart, your mind, when it's feeling peaceful, when it's feeling excited, when it's feeling safe, when it's feeling tender, and your partner is feeling the same way, that's the first wave that I'm looking at. I'm also looking to amplify consciousness. So I will ask myself, how old am I inside? At different points. Sometimes I'm 15 years old. I'm just this excited adolescent, and I'm curious, and I want to push boundaries a little bit, and I want to wrestle, and okay, I'm 15 years old. I want to know how old my partner is. Inside, how old do you feel right now? So that's another metric of consciousness. And it brings distinction and it brings consciousness because, for example, if I'm feeling 15 years old and a bit rambunctious and my partner is feeling 2 years old and very innocent, it's my job, in this case as the older psychological age, to consciously shift into an energy that's more appropriate, or to be present with my partner until she can mature. For example, what's regressing her to 2 years old? Is it a fear? Is it a shame? Is it is she reliving a memory? And will she tell me? And can we liberate and love her in that terrain, thus freeing up the consciousness to move on to the next age at which she may pause? So we're talking about a conscious fluidity of the ages and a partnering. Number 3, the balance between physical stimulation and heart-centered feeling. This is one of the most important ones for me because the body being so dense, it's very easy to get lost in sensation. Now, this is neither right nor wrong, but in shamanism, the emphasis is on the heart. The emphasis is on being in such a way that one's partner's heart deepens, which, for example, doesn't happen if you are overwhelming them. If you flood any conscious mind with too much sensitivity, stimulation, and dimension too quickly, they will dissociate. They will close down their heart to get a grip on themselves, to kind of find themselves. They will shut down on some level. And so if the focus is on growing the heart, the question is cuddling the sweet point, the point at which awareness and growing of the heart is the biggest? Is kissing and nuzzling and hugging? Is hugging in this position? Is being like this? Is it being like that? So it's finding that place. And the biggest area that I'm conscious of is in intercourse, vaginal or anal intercourse, which tends to be some of the strongest sensation, at least for me. Am I losing my sense of self or my heart and getting lost in the addictive cycle of more and more and faster, versus the shamanistic journey of being present and expanding awareness? And this is a very important dimension to be aware of, that the addictive cycle does not expand awareness. Rather, the addictive cycle requires more and more cocaine to get the same high, more and more speed to get the same pleasure, more and more dominance to feel the same level of power, more and more pain to receive the same exquisite level of awareness. If you watch the McKinsey documentary and look at McKinsey cycle, you'll find that amidst all of the data and the science and the wonderful liberation that he brought with the movie, I think it's called McKinsey, he ultimately spiraled in the direction of more and more variety and more pain, until he ended up in the untenable situation that no amount of variety and pain could generate the level of arousal necessary to release, to feel satisfied. And this is one direction. More and more speed, intensity, drugs, variety, pain, and stimulation to get less and less return, because the brain desensitizes us to anything that is familiar, which is why a bouquet of daffodils can bring a sense of joy and smile from a new girlfriend that exceeds getting into one's $80,000 Mercedes, which one has driven for 3 years, because it might have been this big high to buy the Mercedes and get in the first time to take the Mercedes on a test drive. But after 3 years, it's so unconscious that you're not comparing it to what it was like to drive a Volkswagen 1960s Beetle with all the bumps and stuff with the Mercedes. You're not even conscious you're in a Mercedes. Your mind is on something else, some problem that's new. And this principle means that to counteract this, what we need to do is grow the self. Because so this is the physical journey of more and more arousal and substance and intensity and variety to bring pleasure to consciousness. So this is kind of spiritual laziness with extreme hedonism and creativity. Now, this is not wrong. That's just one extreme. And it ultimately ends up with being dissatisfied with everything. The other extreme is to be totally present in the moment and to grow one's consciousness to where a single thread of hair or the sound of a bell is exquisite ecstasy. And you're sitting cross-legged in meditation at 10-hour intervals or in silence, and every hour there's this bell, and it's the most beautiful sound you have ever heard. Your consciousness is completely present to the sound of the bell. And there's the mastery. There's the altered state. There's the sense of transcendence and divinity coming through one. And you're sitting in boring clothes, in uncomfortable environments, with no one touching you, and no good lighting, and no music. In other words, it's the exact opposite. So on the one hand, one grows the self and consciousness to the height of ecstatic moment with the kind of ascetic extreme of minimalism. And on the other hand, you grow and you pamper the self with the extreme of hedonism, where you're about the gold-plated toilets and the gold-plated door handles and the butlers and the sexual slaves and the foods and the this and the music and the ambiance and the full-screen doorways and all of that. And they're both looking for the same thing. Every human consciousness is ultimately looking at a transcendent moment, an altered state. And whether it's power and money and sex and dominance and pain and pleasure and stimulation and food and drugs and luxury and imagination and whim, whether it's that direction or whether it's the direction of the joy in the moment. The joy in the moment. Both consciousnesses are looking for something that is bigger than the self, something that transcends the self. And I would suggest that for the contemporary shaman, male or female, that it's the dance between. That it's looking for the path of elegance in these two paradoxical journeys. So what does that look like? It means that when it is easier to feel grateful, to feel joy, to feel abundant, to feel love, to feel gratitude, by making the money to go from a noisy, dingy, one-star hotel with smoke fumes coming in from the neighbor and a child screaming upstairs and just a sense of, psychological hell. When it's easier to make the money to go from that one-star hell to a five-star hotel in which one wakes up feeling alive and grateful and happy and yes, and I I feel dominion of my environment, and no one's I'm waking when I want to, and I'm comfortable, and I'm going to eat the food that I love. When it's easier to do that, and when that's bringing high yields in gratitude, in joy, and abundance, enjoy that path. And when it becomes a trap, when it's never enough, when it's, the hotel staff didn't even remember to do this and didn't do and they forgot the petal of flowers. They're supposed to put a lotus petal on my pillow, and mine was a bit wilted. I'm gonna, call and complain. When it's not enough, when it becomes addictive, then it's the other extreme. It can be, okay, let's go out in nature. Let's enjoy being rained on and just being here and being present and letting it all go. Let's give it away. Let's give it away. Let's take someone who's never had a 5-star hotel experience and let's give them a gift. And let's enjoy their pleasure of looking at it through fresh eyes. Let's give them a gift. Let's go and buy toys for children and give them away. And focus on letting go. Going the opposite extreme. And it's probably, I don't actually have a philosophy for one or the other, but I know that from a spiritual point of view, given that the body is temporal, we've got up to 120 years currently on the planet. It seems to be the max at present. And yet there are parts of us which I believe from my visceral experiences, both on psychedelics and meditation and the commonality of most of the 10,000 languages, cultures, religions, and traditions, speaking of some part of us that is bigger than the conscious self. Knowing that, and knowing that you're not going to take that Mercedes with you, but you will take the joy and gratitude with you. That it's the state, it's the emotional and mental state that matters. And so it's the journey of creating those things, the journey of creating those goals, the journey of enjoying those goals. It's the teaching that physical matter is an opportunity to receive. Going back to that business analogy, money doesn't lie. If a particular approach leaves you bankrupt, that's the way it is. And so there's a chance to learn why. Because money is really a dance with people. And one receives money, rightly or wrongly, when you help people get what they ask for, or think they want, or actually want. When you help a lot of people and do so in a clear agreement frame in a legal structure involving money, one has a lot of money. And when one cannot or does not give a lot of people what they want, one doesn't have money. And there's all the backstories and stuff of you got to learn the skills. You got to learn to be able to manufacture the things or the services or the experiences that people want and know they want and are willing to pay for. And then you have lots of money. And so money is really a relational representation, meaning If you make a lot of people happy, it boils down to you will be very rich. And if you don't, you won't. And that's very, very crude summary, but it's a good place to begin. Who can I be of service to that values what I can do or what I could learn to do so much that they would give generously to me? And so that being a playground, there's, for that, and keeping the body alive and pampered and all that, then the rest is about what we take with us beyond the body. So I'm going to pause here, and I'll come back with a couple other metrics to be aware of. Another distinction and kind of arena to play in shamanism and sexuality is imagery. What are you seeing in yourself and in your partner? So, for example, I might be presently moving, and I look into my inner eye and I see a lot of dark smoke. So the first question is, what is the feeling around that dark smoke? And maybe it has a sense of impatient irritation. Okay, so I've got, and what is the density of the smoke? And let's say it's 50%. So I'd say, okay, there's a dimension that I'm seeing in which there is irritation and impatience that is present 50%. Is it in me? Is it in my partner? Is it in both? Number one. Is it in the present? Is it in the past? Number two. If it's in me, is it mine, or is it my dad's, or is it my brother's, or is it the guy that was honking at me when I was motorcycling because he didn't like something I did, or whose is it? Where does it come from? And these are, what you're looking for is kind of like a bell, like, aha, that there's an indication within the language. It could be auditory, in my case it's visual, where the pattern seems to line up, to come into focus. Now, it's not a perfect science by any means, but I'm looking for what do I see and what does it align with. The most important question of all is, how do I clear it? Meaning, since I don't want the sexual amplification to be an amplification of impatience and irritation, what do I bring in to the space to clear the energy? So number one, if it's smoke and if it's dark gray black, I'll try a color wash. So let's bring in a cream color and flood the smoke with cream. What happens? Does the cream get dirty? Does the smoke get clean? You watch. I watch. Two, I might bring in sound. What would be the sound that would dispel, that would break the molecules down of that smoke? Because smoke has a molecular structure. And if you bring in a vibration or a sound that is sub-smoke structure, that could be subatomic, it could be sub-quark, it could be whatever. If you bring in a vibration that's pre-structure, it's a little bit like if your house is made of wood, but your wood is made of atoms. If you bring in a sound that disrupts the atomic relationship with all the molecular particles, the house will collapse because the wood will dissolve and the house is held together by those wood structures. And so this is where science and grounded imagination and logic is actually your friend rather than the enemy. And this is why I love science and I love business and I love looking at patterns, because it gives you a language to start exploring. And so is sound the most efficient way? Now, yes, it could be sound, it could be color, but what you're looking for is ease. You're looking for it to play, to know that it can be broken or dissolved or healed in a number of ways. What's the way? Is it by emoting something? Was it an angry charge? Like that, I was back to that motorcyclist. I tensed up my calf muscles, and what I really wanted to do is say, fuck off. You know, cut out that beeping at me. Fuck off. And will that release the charge? Because in shamanism, particularly acultural shamanism, that means it's neither cultural or not, it's what works. What we're looking to do is, with the least amount of energy, dispel toxins and transform them and free them up to reform as nutrients. That's the essence of it. Now, telling someone literally to fuck off may create a chain reaction and da-da-da-da-da, and then they get upset and all that. But if in meditation, you're clear that the purpose is simply to release the fear that's in that muscle. And anger is a great way to transmute fear. And so, because it may be a trauma, and trauma deals with a biological area of the brain that's fight, flight. So running or attacking can release the chemicals that frees the consciousness from holding trauma in a timeless place. And so you may, if it's a fear that's something to do with trauma, it feels like, you know, you don't have a right to exist, no one's allowing you to be and all that. It's touching on that. Maybe an aggressive, ah, ha, will tell your body you're safe. There's someone in you who will fight for your life. Someone is there who cares. I can relax. Now I can go back to being loving and spiritual and da-da-da. And you look at the energy pattern. This is why it's a culture. Oh, I could never curse. I could never hurt a fly. I could never. If you get cancer and die and are sick and depressed for weeks so that you can maintain the delusion that you amongst all humans have no anger, have no nothing, da-da-da-da-da, that is not doing anyone any good. If it doesn't touch a trauma center and you don't need to be angry, you can bring in some white light and it clears. That you've got to be real with what is. This is where the bank account comes in. The universe will take care of me. It's all for the best, blah, 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 blah. You're bankrupt. It's not working. It's not working. Get real. What does work? So the bank account can tell you where you're lying to yourself. The energetic bank account is just as real. I love you, I forgive everyone, blah, 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 blah. If you're getting sick, depressed, covertly hostile, tensed up in your muscles as you're saying and doing all that, it's not working. If expressing anger and hate, you know, they did this to me, and it's getting, and it's growing, that's not working. The elegance is looking at what works. So in this process, what you're looking to do is transmute, transcend, transform in a sustainable and effective way, where you spend the least amount of energy to cause the least amount of harm for the most amount of benefit. It's the relationship with the two. So, we live in a dualistic world. It's a reality that me being here in Thailand has spent jet fuel to, 3 planes, and my partner's plane. There's all kinds of costs to being here. And they're not all pretty, meaning I don't want to fill the atmosphere with jet fuel. I don't want to spend tens of thousands of dollars. I don't want to. There's all this stuff, but the reality for me is that it's 3 times easier for me to be myself here. And that's a spiritual goal, to integrate with myself. And I need that support right now. I am not strong enough to be myself in the United States to the same degree I can here. That's a reality. It's very simple to measure reality. How much fear do I have there? How much fear do I have here? How creative am I in a spiritual sense over there? How creative am I in a spiritual sense over here? This video would not be happening if I was in the United States. It's that simple. Having gone back and forth 14 months, I spent 14 months in recent years in Thailand, and doing the analysis, this is what happens in my month in the US, and then I come back and this is what happens in a month here. There are things that happen in Thailand that happen 1,000 times more. No, I shouldn't say 1,000. 1,000% more. So I'll notice, for example, that I had 10 times of a certain kind of an experience in the last month in Thailand than I did in the next month in the United States. That's data. And I'm honest with that. And yes, I'm willing to spend the tens of thousands of dollars, the time off work, the jet fuel, the jet lag, the this, the that, the whatever, and the other risks. I'm willing to pay all of that to have this environment, because I'm excited, for example, about this video. It's exciting. It's got some real joy behind it. And that joy is more important to me than how it comes about exactly. So I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to steal. I'm not going to hurt someone for this joy. But if I can, I will create it in an ethical way. And so that's kind of going back into that dance where the more we control our outer environment, the easier it is to control our inner state. Meaning, if I've got doors slamming near me and kids crying and couples having angry arguments and irritable hotel staff glaring at me and waitresses that don't bring what they asked and the food tastes disgusting, the reality is that I'm not going to maintain the state that you're seeing here. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh might, and various people with a really strong inner core might. But I won't. And so contemporary shamanism for me is accepting that I am willing to learn what I can about meditation and etc. And I'm willing to learn what I can about business and money and create an environment in which it is easier for me to maintain the state that I want to maintain. And I don't see it as cheating, because the state of America, it's not like a neutral state. It's not like I'm in the forest with nice, emotional, present people in America. That would be easy. I'm in a country that is so fanatic about efficiency that I will have hostility and fear directed at me if I'm slowing anyone down, if I'm not doing this and that in traffic, if there's just so many things. If I approach many women in the United States, I'm immediately seen in a predatory light, and I have all these projections coming at me that are not healthy, that are not me, they're actively rejecting who I am. They're making it very hard. I have to unravel all those projections to come back to me, to remember, oh no, I'm not all that. That's just what they're seeing. That's what they're imagining. That's how they're treating me, but that's not me. This is me. And so it's not a neutral environment. It's a very hostile environment for some of the states that I'm consciously trying to cultivate. And going back to the sexual theme, I'm going to look at how to transmute, transcend, transform that 50% smoke in the most elegant way that I can. Number one, I'm going to play around with it until it does shift. And I'm going to know that because the visual will shift, one, and two, the feeling will shift. There's less irritation in the air. And this brings me to a new aspect and a new question in shamanism, because, and this is an area that's very new for me. It's very ephemeral. It's not new as a question, but it's new as a skill set. I do not have a reliable skill set for finding out the difference between the part of me that is fed up with bullshit, meaning I've met people in my life that have spent decades saying something that they didn't fully believe, that didn't work, meaning the reality and their emotional state had not transformed in decades, yet they're still hanging on to this tattered statement or dogma, metaphysical or otherwise. The universe will take care of me. Well, how? Do you feel taken care of? Do you feel grateful? What's been going on in your bank account? What's been going on in your job? What's been going on in your relationship? What's the basis for saying that? Because you're saying that and you're doing absolutely nothing. And the reality is your state and your life is getting worse, and you don't even believe this. But you're using this statement, the universe will take care of me, to do nothing. You're not changing because you're holding on to this tattered thing. And I hate that kind of bullshit. Because if it's working, great. The universe takes care of me. Your reality is going up. Your state is going up. Whatever you're doing is embodying that truth. Wonderful. But look to the reality inside and outside, and don't lie about it. And so there's a part of me that wants to fight and challenge this kind of lying that hurts everyone. And to do that, look some real negativity in the face and talk about it. And then there's another part that's, just so excited about the transcendent, around the possibility, around all the help that's there, around all the love that's there, and wants to focus on that. And how to be of service. One, how to protect myself from the pain of being viewed as an idiot, which is painful. And, what's that balance? And so I'm exploring that in this, in this conversation. And I notice it in my body, and I notice it in my mind, I notice it in my heart. And sometimes I step off the path. And like right now, my cheekbones have stepped off the path. And so I think probably the best thing is a little recalibration. So let's do that now. And I want to introduce you to a crystal consciousness, which for so many years, crystal consciousness was a dogma for me. Meaning, you read any spiritual, metaphysical book about crystals, and they all say the same thing. Crystals are good. They're positive, they're spiritual, and some will go to elaborate, lengths, like this kind of crystal will change the world, this one will clear all negative energy. And, at some point, it became meaningless because I literally have 2 tons of crystal in and around my home. I have a geode pair that's 400 pounds a piece, so an 800-pound geode pair. I have 400-pound quartz generators. I have rose quartz, citrine, tourmaline. I have a lot of crystals. And it was always funny to me, buying these, some of the sellers would say, oh yeah, this will clear all the negativity in your whole neighborhood and all that. And it's like, I've got one of the angriest neighbors you've ever met. And having 2 tons of crystals doesn't seem to have made the slightest dent in that. And so there's a lot of rubbish. On the other hand, they're good, they amplify energy and all that. It was all head stuff. And then around the time I had my first psychedelic journey with psilocybin and LSD, the relationship with the crystals changed. And I have a very different experience with them. And the experience is much less about the physical object and more about the consciousness that is present. I don't know if it's through or in the aura, and it doesn't even matter. But what's most beautiful and exciting for me connecting with crystals is the presence of the being that is connected, channeled, present in, around, is, the spirit consciousness of that crystal. And the fact that in each case, It's more clear, less judgmental, more beautiful, more transcendent, more magical. Touches my heart in a way that no human being has ever done. And in that sense is closer to source than human culture. There isn't hardly any of us, and particularly in contemporary shamanism, we're all acculturated, which means we have the best and the worst, the blessing and the curse of what the majority of people around us have all decided to do, say, think, feel, and believe. And whether we agree with it or not, we're a part of it. And crystal consciousness is not. Crystal consciousness is not a part of that. It hasn't bought in. All the chauvinism, all the lies, no investment in that. And so when I want to come back to joy and take it to a new level, when I want to find myself, when I want to find a self that is outside of the culture, it's to crystals that I'll turn. And so I'll introduce you to this truly beautiful crystal right here. And I want to encourage you to consider the possibility, to consider it, whether or not you can feel anything from this crystal, which is not bound by time and space. It's a very feminine crystal, so it's very, very gentle veils of presence, of joy, of presence, of generosity, of being, that for me is profoundly medicinal as I deal with the level of my brain where I've bought into the lie that I'm only as valuable as the money I make, as the intelligence I have to articulate things in scientific terms, as the ability to manipulate, dominate, and control effectively, and the ability to produce and be respected in this culture as my appearance. It's a very, very deep wound. And there's a part of my brain that is sick with that wound, that is terrified that I have no value outside of that very thin, shallow, and very hostile veneer. And yet, the parts of me that this crystal touch are much bigger parts of me. They have nothing to do with that chauvinism, with those lies, with those pathetic compromises of a culture that gives up so much of who we are to look good in such narrow terms, and often with such spite, such pain, such envy, such competitiveness, such comparison and judgment, that we all become ugly and small, filled with shame and misery and secrets and resentments. It's so sad. And yet, a consciousness that is completely outside of that reminds us that it is truly our choice to buy in to such a culture. It's truly our choice. And it's our choice to step out again. And those feelings, the feelings of realizing that the gratitude for our friends, our helpers, our guides, meaning those available and willing to be guides, when we make ourselves available and willing to ask, 1, open, 2, see, 3, follow, 4, and be willing to make mistakes and be wrong and fuck up and do it all over again. Those guides are always there. And so that's the last and most important piece of the sexual algorithm of contemporary shamanism, is opening to those guides, opening to those crystals, opening to those consciousness that are 1,000 times more free than our own, are 1,000 times more beautiful than the acculturated barbarity that we have become. Not who we are, but the acculturated barbarity of who we've become. 1,000 times more beautiful and available. The price, of course, is giving up our attachment to winning the cultural predatory race. One of my teachers pointed out that computers can always beat a human mind at chess. But a computer cannot choose whether or not to play the game. A human can unplug the machine and focus on another area of their life. A human cannot beat a computer at chess, but it can decide that loving a partner, that raising a child with kindness, that giving gifts to a community is more important to who they are as a human being than playing chess or not. And a computer cannot decide that. A computer and the robots who are asleep in the cultural program cannot decide to step off the game board. It is our humanity. It is our inner beauty that allows us to say no. This is not the game I want to play. The game I want to play is here. And I'm going to use my guile, my creativity, my love, my passion, my joy, my intelligence, my strategy, my mathematical discipline, my money, my time, to create a new playground in which all of us can play games that are more rewarding than chess. This is our human freedom. And as I wrap up this segment of contemporary shamanism, I want to leave you with that possibility. I want to leave us with that possibility. What games are we playing that, whether or not we are winning or losing them, we are losing just by playing them relative to the many things out there? What things out there and in here can blossom beautifully with our love, with our attention, with our gifts, with our strengths? I'll leave this segment with that thought.